If you're building or have already built a high quality audio system, chances are you'll already have all of the big pieces in place. You've either bought them already or they're in your roadmap. I wonder though if you've included the ultimate hi-fi system secret ingredient. When I'm not making videos or listening to music to review audio gear, I love to cook. If you do too, be sure to check out the YouTube channel called Sorted Food. This isn't an ad for them, but it's relevant to our discussion today about the hi-fi secret ingredient. And that secret ingredient is the LAiV Micro DDC, or digital to digital converter. And the reason I'm talking about Sorted Food at the same time as this device is that I've learned a lot from Sorted Food over the years. The biggest lesson is that it's actually pretty easy to cook good food. What's not easy is to make something that's really, really special. Time and time again, the chefs over on Sorted Food have shared little chefy tricks that can transform a good meal into an absolute chef-worthy masterpiece. For example, a simple decision such as adding salt while you saute the onions can completely transform the entire flavour profile of an otherwise simple dish. People eating the dish may not specifically know what's different, but they will know that it tastes amazing because of that one little decision you made, putting the salt in with the onions rather than adding the same amount of salt but later. And so what's this got to do with the digital converter? Let's unpack that. And we're going to go a little bit detailed and a little bit techie today, so grab your favourite drink, snack or a 3-course meal and let's dive in. And first, let me explain what a DDC or a digital to digital converter even does. Before I do that though, I should also quickly mention another secret ingredient product. The comfort of your headphones, the ability to tweak their sound a little bit, or being able to remove cable clutter and cable mess can all be the difference between a sublime listening session or an underwhelming one. Even a frustrating one sometimes. That's where channel sponsor Koaxial Audio comes into the picture. They make headphone pads to tweak the sound and comfort of your headphones, but they also make a brilliant modular cable system where you can have one end for your amp, whether it's 6.3mm, 4.4mm, etc. And then at the other end, you can connect whatever you need for the headphones you're listening to at the time. So just one cable for the amplifier. 1 minute, it's a 3-pin XLR connection. The next minute, it's a twin 3.5mm connection. That means you only have to buy one length of cable that connects to your amplifier and then just these really nice short and tidy pieces going to the headphones. It's a brilliant way to remove cable clutter. They also have some fantastic comfort options for things like headphones, IEMs, wireless earphones, wireless headphones, and you can check them all out at DaConiAudio.com. But more importantly than that, you can also have a 10% discount at DaConiAudio.com. All you need to do is put in Passion for Sound 10 at the checkout, and anything and everything I've spoken about today will be 10% off. So just go to DaConiAudio.com, use the code Passion for Sound 10, and enjoy your next listening experience that much more. Now, let's get back to DDCs. Regardless of the brand or the model of a digital to digital converter, it's always going to do one thing the same, which is take a digital input coming in and then turn that into different digital outputs going out. So that means it's going to take the input from a streamer, a CD transport, maybe a computer, and convert that into a different digital signal going out the other side. The key thing here though is that DDCs aren't upsamplers. They're not changing the signal in any way other than the protocol that it's using. In other words, going from optical to AES, AES to I2S, USB to Coaxial. It's always the same signal, just in a different protocol. What that means is the data that goes into the DDC is the same data that comes out of the DDC. And if that sounds completely useless, I do understand, but it also might suggest that you're not completely familiar with digital circuits. After all, if you're not completely familiar with digital circuits in audio, you might assume that all digital connections and all digital transmissions in audio are created equal. They're not though. Because the data in digital connections is actually transmitted using analog signals, in other words, fluctuating voltages on wires, or because it's a series of light pulses and therefore has to be converted at each end from the fluctuating voltages into light pulses and then from light pulses back into fluctuating voltages, all of those processes are susceptible to noise, interference, and timing problems. And more than that, the devices at each end of this chain are also very complex. They contain both digital and analog processors of all different sorts. And those processors, separate to just the digital signal that we're talking about, all the other processors can also be disrupted by noise. And that brings us to the value of a DDC. It's also where the LAiV micro DDC is a bit different from the other competition. For $849, the LAiV micro DDC takes all sorts of different inputs. It's got Coaxial, it's got AES, I2S, and USB. There is no optical if that's important to you. After it receives signals through any of those inputs, it outputs it through just one option, which is I2S, and only I2S. For some people, that's an immediate deal breaker if your DAC doesn't use I2S. For other people, you're rejoicing because you only want to use I2S. What the micro DDC allows you to do then is to take any of those other digital inputs in, switch between them with the buttons on top of the device here, and send an I2S version of that signal onto your downstream DAC. And speaking of all the different inputs and then also the output, there is a small problem we need to raise here. Actually, in two ways, it's a small problem. And that is that the very compact size of the micro DDC means that when you have a bunch of cables hanging out the back of it, it tends to want to tip over or be pulled off the desk. And so the compact size is good in one way, but not so good in the other if you want to have a bunch of different connections to it. The team at LAiV tell me that they do have a solution on the way for that. There's going to be some sort of cable support system that prevents the device from tipping over or pulling backwards. So watch out for that one. If you've got one of these already, there is a solution coming. If you buy it in the future, it may or may not be included. I don't know the details yet. But coming back to the functions of the micro DDC, being small isn't the only thing it's doing differently. Where the micro DDC takes lots of different inputs and spits out a single I2S output, most other DDCs that I've tried do the opposite. Most DDCs that I've come across take a USB input and spit out multiple other digital outputs. So it's a one in and many out versus in the case of the micro DDC, many in and one out. Take my Singxer SU6 as an example. That's the DDC that I've been using. It only has USB coming in, but then it outputs optical, coaxial, AES, and I2S, and more than one of those outputs in a couple of cases. The topping U90 was similar, USB in and various other digital outputs. And so that's really handy, things like the U90 or the SU6, for people that want to run multiple DACs. You can feed a single stream of data from your streamer, your CD transport, or your computer into the SU6, for example, and then output to many different DACs if you want to. But it's less handy for people that might want to run multiple sources. And that's where the micro DDC could make more sense for some people. After all, most people don't run a bunch of different DACs. What they might run though is a bunch of different sources. Sources like a PC with a USB output, and then maybe a CD transport with a coaxial output, and perhaps then there's also a streamer with an AES or an I2S output. And having just said all that, I know what some of you are probably thinking right now, which is, my DAC's got all those different inputs, so why not just plug them all straight into the DAC? Fair question. Let's circle back to the salt and the onions. What any DDC is doing is a little bit more complex than just switching between different inputs and outputs or even multiplying from one to many. They're also there to isolate your source from your DAC and therefore isolate any noise coming along for the ride. That's going to prevent any noise coming from your source or picked up via the cables from getting into your DAC at the other end and messing with its various circuits. On top of that, during the conversion process, the DDC is also going to fix and improve the timing accuracy of those signals. The micro DDC can also receive an input from a 10 MHz master clock. If that's something you want to do, you can have one clock that defines the sound for your entire system. And so in short, what the micro DDC is doing is buffering the signal as it comes in. It's reclocking that signal to maintain perfect timing accuracy, or as best as it can, and then it's also isolating any noise by sending it out through a galvanically isolated I2S socket. Galvanic isolation is just a way of saying that it keeps electrical noise coming into the micro DDC from getting out through the I2S output. And the micro DDC will do this for any sample rates, all the way from basic CD quality sound up to DSD 512 and PCM 768 kHz. And now, while I've started throwing around big technical terms and numbers, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of reclocking, what it's about and why it matters. And don't worry, I will get to some sonic impressions of the micro DDC in just a moment, but I think it's worth understanding first what a DDC is intending to do and not intending to do. We're going to get a little bit techie for a moment, but I'll keep it as short and as simple as I possibly can. There are two main issues that occur with the timing of digital signals. One of them we hear about regularly, It's called jitter. Jitter refers to random variations in the timing of the signal. If we think about a digital signal, it's made up of samples taken at a regular interval of time, sort of snapshots of the audio if you like. Those samples should occur with precisely the same intervals between each snapshot. In regular CD audio, which is sampled at 44,100 times per second, that means that the interval between each of those snapshots or samples is 1/44,100th of a second. And because any digital device needs to be able to process and correctly manage the timing of these signals, they all use things called clocks. Not clocks like on the wall, but little tiny chips that put out a very regular and very rapid series of ticks. They tend to use one clock for the family of sample rates that are built on 44.1 kHz, and then a different clock for the family of sample rates built on 48 kHz. In the micro DDC, they're using a clock that runs at 45.158 MHz to do all of the 44.1 kHz sample rates. And if these numbers are getting overwhelming, don't worry about the details. All you need to know is that that clock for the 44.1 kHz sample rates ticks every 22.146 nanoseconds. To make it simpler, let's pretend it ticks every 22 nanoseconds. It doesn't, but let's pretend. And so if the digital device is relying on a regular ticking of that clock every 22 nanoseconds, jitter is when the intervals between those ticks aren't at 22 nanoseconds. One time the interval might be 22 nanoseconds. The next time it might be 22.2 nanoseconds, then 22.1 nanoseconds, then maybe 21.9 nanoseconds, then 22, 22.3, 22.2, and so on. That is jitter. It's where each of the samples or each of the ticks are not exactly the same distance apart as they should be. And the end result would look something like this instead of like this. But then there's the timing error that we rarely hear discussed. It's called phase noise. And phase noise can cause jitter, but it's also a lot more than jitter. It's the tendency of the clock to drift off frequency somewhat more permanently. And so while jitter results in these random timing errors, phase noise results in more consistent timing errors. With phase noise, those ticks that are meant to be happening every 22 seconds, if there's phase drift, it could start happening every 22.2 nanoseconds. In other words, every single sample would be happening at the wrong frequency, even though it's consistent. So with jitter, it would go from 22 to 22.2 to 21.9, etc. With phase noise, it could go from 22 to 22.2, 22.2, 22.2, 22.2, etc. Over time, it might come back to 22. Maybe it'll drop down to 21.9 for a while. The point is it goes to a different frequency, sits there for a while, and then comes back again. And that drift could happen over and over again if the clock isn't sufficiently precise or is able to be influenced by external factors. Factors like noise entering the device. And you might be thinking that a difference of 0.2 nanoseconds is tiny, which it is. But in the world of audio, and when we know the sensitivity of our ears and our auditory system, that kind of compounding error and shifting error that happens over and over again through a piece of music can have significant impact on the sound. It's going to be especially a problem for high frequency sounds because those change their waveform more regularly. And so if we imagine a complex waveform of music like this one, with phase noise, that waveform might get stretched in some places and squeezed in other places. You can probably imagine what that does to the sound. And so the idea of a DDC like the micro DDC is to do a better job of the clocking than your source device does and possibly than your DAC does. Some DACs will benefit greatly from a DDC, other DACs not as much. And that brings us neatly back around to talking about the sound of the micro DDC with a couple of different DACs. As I just said, the exact result of a product like the micro DDC can vary depending on the DAC you're connecting it to. My testing was with LAiV's own Harmony DAC because I needed a good quality DAC with an I2S input, but I also tried LAiV's new micro DAC, which is newer, a little bit cheaper, and obviously much, much smaller. That means it's also less complex than the Harmony DAC. And so the theory for me was that this might get more benefit out of the micro DDC than the Harmony DAC did. Now, if you want to know more about this little guy here, I've got the full review coming up, so subscribe if you're keen on that one. But coming back to the micro DDC now and testing it between the full-sized Harmony DAC and the little micro DAC there, the micro DDC showed sonic benefits on both. Whether it was due to clocking performance or noise isolation, is a bit more difficult to say. The key point is that the micro DDC improved the sound quality, even with a premium DAC like the Harmony. And the first test that I tried was to put the micro DDC in between my computer's USB output and the Harmony DAC. With the micro DDC in the circuit, the sound was richer and smoother. Some might hear the sound of the USB connected straight to the Harmony DAC as being more detailed and textured, but it's hard to know if that's really what's going on. The fact that it seemed a bit more fatiguing to me when I had the USB cable connected directly to the Harmony DAC makes me think that what was going on was actually noise. And that's because there's a funny thing that happens with noise, and this works in the visual realm too. If you take a digitally edited photo that you've taken with your camera and you add a tiny bit of almost imperceptible noise to it, it actually makes the image seem sharper. With audio, if you add a little bit of system noise that's, say, coming down the USB wire from your computer, when you add that to audio, three things tend to happen. Firstly, it can make the sound seem a little bit crisper and more detailed. Secondly, it can make the sound a little bit more fatiguing and harder to listen to. And then finally, it tends to reduce the sense of space between sounds in the soundstage and can result in a flatter overall soundstage from front to back. And the more I listened to the Harmony DAC via USB from my computer and then with and without the micro DDC, the more I was consistently enjoying the sound with the micro DDC. I can't stress enough that the differences are subtle, but they're also undeniable. And the key difference, as I spent lots of time with both setups, was that the micro DDC setup was consistently smoother, but just as detailed. And that to me is the sign of a really exceptional digital system. If it can be smoother and more relaxed and easier to listen to without losing any sense of detail or resolution or texture, then that's a sign that it's been set up really well and that things like noise have been controlled really well. And that to me is a great reason to consider adding something like a micro DDC if you have a DAC that has an I2S input. And speaking of that, I should talk about the challenges when we're dealing with I2S. I2S isn't a standardized protocol. Different brands use different pins within the HDMI plug and socket to transfer different parts of the signal. That can make compatibility really challenging sometimes. In the micro DDC, LAiV have addressed that by allowing you to scroll through a series of different I2S configurations. That's for the input. All you need to do is hold down the I2S button for a couple of seconds. It's then going to change modes, and then you can toggle the I2S button to cycle through the different modes. Just flick through until you find the right one that's compatible with your source. Because remember, this is for the input only. When it comes to your DAC, you'll have to do the same sort of configuration for the HDMI input on your DAC to configure it to be compatible with the uDDC. And then if you're doing that, you might be thinking about connecting the micro DDC up to all sorts of different digital inputs. You might be thinking about using AES, I2S, Coaxial, or the aforementioned USB. And so I wanted to see if there was any difference between those different inputs. Does it matter which one you choose? To run this test, I fed my USB signal into the Singxer SU6 DDC that I've been using, and I took out from that the AES connection, the Coaxial connection, and the I2S connection. I was going to start off by saying that there was a huge difference between the AES connection and the I2S connection. That was my first impression. But then I realized that the I2S configuration was wrong on the uDDC. What it was doing was that it was switching the left and the right channels. And so when I compared the I2S input with the AES input, the switch of channels made it sound completely different, and it was enough to trick me into thinking that something major was going on. Be aware of that if you're ever testing anything via I2S and comparing it to a different input. Once I fixed the configuration though, things were much more similar. They might have still been a touch different, but it's very hard to narrow down what the cause of that was. Each of the connections I was using meant a different cable type, they're different connection types, and all of those things can influence the sound. In fact, I even emailed LAiV directly and said, am I hearing things or is this to be expected? And they explained the same things. They said that different connectors have different impedances, different contact types can alter the sound, and even the cable materials and the various impedance that they create can all alter the sound profile. Just a little bit, but it can all happen. The good news is that regardless of which input type I used with the micro DDC, the output was always excellent. I didn't feel like there was ever a drop-off in sound quality, so much as just a slight change in sound quality. And in most cases, the differences were small enough that you could easily think of it as a trick of the mind. I don't believe it was based on my discussions with LAiV, but that's how small the differences are. A difference that was far less subtle than that was my choice of USB cable feeding into the micro DDC. Just as a DAC can be influenced by noise coming from the rest of the system, i.e. the source, so I'm going to assume can the micro DDC. Running the micro DDC with an Oide Neo Plus USB, I'm not sure how you pronounce their brand, and then swapping over to a tubeless consensus USB cable, I heard significant differences in the sound. The sound with the tubeless consensus cable was smoother, easier to listen to, and had a significantly better sense of space, separation, and image focus within the soundstage. The sound with the Oide cable just came across more forceful and in your face. It was clearly a less enjoyable sound, and again, it's going to be all about noise. And so what that means to us is that the quality of the source and the quality of the cables feeding into the micro DDC do still matter. The micro DDC will improve whatever you give to it, but it's not a miracle worker. It doesn't negate the importance of having quality upstream sources and the interconnects that are connecting them. And speaking of improving the sound and having better quality gear, another test that I thought was going to be interesting was to see how the micro DDC could elevate a cheaper device to see if it could match a more expensive one. Specifically, could the micro DDC with the conveniently identically sized micro DAC match the Harmony DAC all by itself? And I have to say, this little teeny tiny stack here gets mighty close in performance to the full-sized Harmony DAC. It's not quite the same, and I can see different people preferring one setup over the other, and of course I'll discuss all of that in my full review of the micro DAC, but I thought it was interesting that it did get very, very close to the Harmony DAC. And so as a reminder, make sure you subscribe for the micro DAC review so you can see and hear the full discussion of that. But for now, I've got two more tests I want to run through before we wrap all this up. The first test was to see how good the clock system is in the micro DDC. And the only way I had to test that was to plug the micro DDC into the LAiV Harmony DAC, because the LAiV Harmony DAC has a bit of a trick. And that is that when it's running on I2S, you can choose to use the clock system inside the Harmony DAC, or you can tell the Harmony DAC to use the clock system of whatever is delivering the I2S signal. And so what I was able to do was flick quickly and easily back and forth between the Harmony DAC's clock circuit and the micro DDC's clock circuit. I would have loved to try this test with some other devices, but none of the others that I have here with I2S give me the choice to use the external clock versus the internal clock. And that's partly because I heard no benefits switching between the different clocks on the Harmony DAC. Whether I used the micro DDC or the Harmony DAC clock, the sound was absolutely identical. And so we can assume that both systems are equivalent, if not the systems being identical. And that brings us now to the final test. And this was an interesting one. I did something that I don't often do when I receive a product for review, and that is I watched somebody else's review of the same product. In that review, a conclusion was drawn that using the micro DDC with a linear power supply instead of the supplied wall wart supply actually reduced the sound quality of the micro DDC. Keeping in mind the fact that not all linear power supplies are created equal, my test went in a different direction. When I compared the included 5-volt wall wart switching power supply that comes with the LAiV micro DDC to a high-quality Geissler Audio linear power supply made here in Australia, the sound quality with the linear power supply was clearly superior. The sound was smoother and more spacious with the linear power supply. That made for an overall larger soundstage with better separation of instruments. It was just a better listening experience. Other than that, tonality, timbre didn't really change, just the sense of smoothness again, that reduction of any sense of noise or glare, and the sense of extra space within the soundstage, both in depth and width. Now, whether it's a big enough difference to justify the expense of a quality linear power supply, that's a whole nother conversation, because you're going to be spending about half as much probably on the linear power supply as the cost of the micro DDC itself. At that point, you might be better off just buying a better DAC to start with. On the other hand, if you already have a good quality 5-volt linear power supply, or maybe a 5-volt battery source that you know is good, it could be worth giving it a go on the micro DDC. And if you already have done that, let us know in the comments, what did you prefer? Did you like the micro DDC with its wall wart supply, or did you prefer it with the external linear supply or battery supply? For now though, let's bring this odyssey to a close. $849 might seem a lot to spend on a device that's really just a moderator or facilitator between your source device and your DAC. If you're building a truly premium sounding system though, I do think it's $849 well spent. I think the micro DDC is a fantastic option, both in terms of its size, its price, and its sound quality. If you're somebody that has maybe multiple digital sources and or a single DAC that you want to feed I2S into, it's going to be great for someone that has a PC, a streamer, and maybe a CD transport, but you only want to use a single DAC with maximum possible sound quality. That's where the micro DDC can be the secret ingredient that lifts the quality of your overall system. On the other hand, if you've got a setup with only a single source like a streamer or a PC with a USB output, you might want to consider the Topping U90 or the Singxer SU6. I haven't compared those directly with the micro DDC because they're very different use cases as to which one you choose. However, my time with the micro DDC and the SU6 would suggest that they're performing on very similar levels. And so if you're more interested in a single USB input and multiple digital output type DDC, then check out my video where I compared the Topping U90 and the Singxer SU6. I've pinned it here at the end of this video to make it easy for you to find it. And before you go, don't forget to claim your 10% discount over at DaconiAudio.com. Just use the code PassionForSound10. And for now, thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.